We are talking with Kiran Singh Sirah, Rotary Peace Fellow, about the art of the folklorist. Thanks for joining us, Kiran. What is a folklorist?
Folklorists do many things. They're kind of people that sometimes hide in communities. You may not always see them, but they're people that traditionally might document groups, cultures, organizations. They're very much interested in the way people interact in society. They're interested in understanding more about people, a bit like anthropologists or sociologists. But folklorists do things in slightly different ways. We very much try to use our emotions. We try to very much use all our senses. And what folklorists are really good at, or what we're trained to do, is to learn how to listen.
What's different about how a folklorist listens?
Listening in ways is not just about listening to a story. It's about understanding that story and the ways people are telling you that story. Does that story necessarily represent them, or does it represent other people?
Kiran, how do folklorists work?
Folklorists do many things. Traditionally, they might use video, film, they may use other ethnographic techniques, but now many folklorists are working in multimedia. They're creating short movies. They are kind of bridging the gap between journalists or travel writing to creating short documentaries.
Can you give us an example of this?
There was a really good film that came out called Style Wars, which is based, with support of city law, and it looked at the art of graffiti bombing in New York City during the 80s. But they tried to unpack what this graffiti bombing, this traditional art form, meant for young people that are living in New York City, living amongst many different types of cultures and traditions.
How did you become a folklorist, Kiran?
I take a sort of, my understanding of folklore is has developed in the last couple of years. Because I come from an arts and museums background, the last 10 years, I've been working in museums in Scotland, working with communities affected by conflict, affected by divisions, and I started to use sort of new ways to interpret our material culture. I started to engage with poets, artists, musicians, rappers, performers, choirs, all sorts of people of faith, of no faith. And I didn't realize what I was doing, but what I was doing was what folklorists study.
Define the concept of folklore for us.
My professor taught us to think about folklore as anthropology of the soul, which I really like, because it's about that kind of engagement with your emotions. But I've been thinking about it more recently, and this idea that folklore is not something that's static. It's something that's constantly changing, and it changes with your involvement when you, as an ethnographer, are working with communities, and it's about that relationship as well. So I quite like to think of folklore as something like, if you imagine music as culture, then dance is the folklore. Dance is something that comes out of that music, but it's constantly moving and constantly changing and constantly evolving, and our definition of dance is always changing. So I quite like to think of the dance as the folklore, and if you think of music as perhaps a group or a culture or a society.
Tell us about meeting Melanie Douglas.
I met Melanie Douglas completely by coincidence. I was in Washington, D.C., and I was working at the time on a summer project with Partners for Democratic Change, where all this kind of idea really sort of came about. And somebody I was living with said that she went to school. When I was explaining about my work back in Scotland and how I was working on, marking the abolition of the British slave trade of 1807, which was a big year in 2007, and I was involved in kind of looking at the legacies of Frederick Douglass, and when he was invited by the Glasgow Emancipation Society to challenge his ideas about slavery, and he spoke in the city chambers, and his legacy lives on. So me now living in the United States, being in the same city as Melanie Douglas, I was connected to Melanie Douglas. She got me on Facebook and she says, "Welcome to DC." I thought that was amazing. We arranged to meet. Melanie is a similar age that I am. She's a mother, she's an artist, she's a writer, she's a poet. She is a beautiful performer. She performed at the Smithsonian Folklife Festival where we met. And then she invited me to her home in Anacostia, which is south of the river in DC. And it's a place where she decided to move to and buy a house and to be part of a community that she wanted to contribute to. She invited me to a local library, which is the Anacostia Library, and it's just around the corner from Frederick Douglass Street, from the house to which Frederick Douglass used to live. So she was kind of like returning to this place. And I wanted to interview her about, well, my initial idea was to interview her about this idea of being a direct descendant of somebody so great, somebody so important, somebody that people learn about in all American schools, a hero. But what was interesting is through the story that she told me something about it's very hard not to only be defined by 1/4 of your heritage, where in fact the Frederick Douglass line is very important for her, but also is the other people that were very important for her, you know, the other people that gave her stories to understand who she is.
Melani's story, Golden Threads, appears in your new toolkit. Describe how your interview with her evolved into this fascinating and enlightening story.
About the actual process was the way we did that is I asked questions and we found a space. And actually, Melani booked a room in the library of the Anacostia Museum, up the library in Anacostia, and I asked a series of questions. But we had more of a sort of conversation, and it was a kind of a back and throw. And she kind of offered new ideas that I hadn't really thought about, you know, including. And then when it came to actually writing this up, now the way that somebody writes up a transcription of an interview is very different, and it's a kind of there's a whole sort of balance of ethics involved, and a whole sort of process. So, and I really do believe that it needs to be sort of a collaborative effort. If I was to, when you write up a transcription, the way we speak is different to the way we read or the way that we might write. So therefore, it's about trying to find a way to write in the voice of the person, of the storyteller, but do it in a way that doesn't do any harm at the same time. And I think one of the process of doing that is to keep going back to the person, where we can use email, now we can use other methods, or we can print these out, we can show people. But you can write up a sort of dialogue that kind of flows, and you might chop and change. So it just means that the reader, the person that reads this, can be able to sort of be taken into the story in a sort of unique way. So you have some type of beginning, middle, and end, and it's sort of so the conversation just basically flows. But the person has to be happy with that. It's kind of, I don't think it's right to be able to take this and edit it so much that it doesn't actually present what the person told you. So it's about going back and forth and making sure that the person sort of agrees that this is my story, this is the story that I want to get out. Because you have to remember that when a storyteller or somebody is speaking to you about their story, they may be speaking to you, but they also might be speaking to a wider world. And you're thinking, are they actually speaking to me, or are they speaking to a wider society? Who do I represent as the ethnographer, as the person gathering the story? Is it just to me, or is it a story they want out to the wider community, the wider society? So it's helpful to think about when you are presenting or you're writing up the story in a collaborative way. It's like, who should actually read this, and what is our job, what is our role, what is our way that we might be able to facilitate some of those things to happen. Melani is also an activist. So in a way, she's sort of not just following in the line of Frederick Douglass, but also her other grandparents, her parents, and her grandparents, great-grandparents. You know, I had a Facebook message from her this morning, and she's creating this memorial for victims of violence in Chicago, and she's active in the community. She's doing work. She's doing work which is about social change. She's collecting, she's participating, she's gathering community, she's forming community, and she's really making a difference. And that's why I find it inspiring. Before, she was someone that represented my hero, but then through talking to her, asking for her story, she's also become one of my heroes.
Yeah.
So that just tells you a little bit about how stories and this process is about relationship building. And that's what I kind of hope that people might use this toolkit for, is about building friendships and building relationships with people and enabling people to come together and share sort of common understanding, or find a place where they can work together and, find new ground.
Tell us about your poem Shelter Stories that appears in the toolkit.
But it's a poem that I wrote as a response to the interviews I was doing with different men that I currently work with in a local homeless shelter. And I interview people through this ethnographic process, but I sometimes do it through meeting people in the street outside the shelter. I have breakfast with the men sometimes at 6 o'clock in the morning. At lunch, I have dinner. I lead writing workshops, and sometimes we meet on the streets in local cafes. And so I sometimes spend the night at the shelter, and I sleep in the same room to do a sort of 48 hours ethnographic project, and I write up a journal. So it becomes a type of collection of these words that are partly from some of the men that I meet, some of my own words, and I kind of formulate them together. But it's a thing I'm kind of working on at the moment, where I write slam poetry as a performer, and that's what I do also. But what I want to try and do is find a way that I like the idea of slam poetry because it's an oral tradition. And if folklorists go and collect oral traditions, then why not put the research back into a form of an oral tradition?
Mm-hmm.
Because in that way you relinquish control. It's like, I don't own this, we own it. And when you work with your consultants or people you're working with, or storytellers, then they own it as well. And then they can take it in any direction they want to take it. So for example, if this particular poem, I printed it out and I gave it to some of the men I was working with, and then they said, well, this is mine. And they will go off and say, they will use it for writing workshops, they will go and read it to some of their friends, or they will go and make friends with different people and engage in poetry workshops. So I quite like that process, and it's trying to find ways to make our work more accessible. We can write up, an ethnographic experience, or we can go and write up a story in some way and create some sort of, booklet, but then sometimes it's like, well, what other ways we can do this in a fun way and a more engaging way, and a way which is more about us working together.
Yeah.
Some of the lines are taken from actual interviews, and some of the lines are taken from just the experience of sharing food in a space with different people.
Where have you performed Shelter Stories?
Well, I performed it to the shelter community. So the idea was that I wrote it up and then I performed it with the people that I gathered the material from in a space at the shelter. But I've also now performed it in other places. I performed it at the American Folklore Society conference. I performed a version of this at the UN when I gave this talk at the United Nations. And it was a version of this, but not quite the same. And then I've also used it for conferences, in just talking to different people. Sometimes I do it alongside other performance pieces that I do that explore other parts of the world or people that I've worked with. And I sometimes just do it on the street corners. I wear my kilt and I have my spodden. I have a collection of poems in my spodden, and sometimes I just do random spontaneous poetry to people. I used to do poetry with a bunch of friends back in Glasgow when we had the two football teams, two big soccer teams that used to play, and at that time there's a lot of sectarian violence in our city. So we decided to read poetry, slam poetry, on the subway train as a way to kind of keep... So I think poetry can be used in very creative ways. And I like the idea of doing something like this because you can, although it's on paper at the moment, but the idea should be, it's only there so you can rehearse the lines, but then it's written in a way to be performed. And slam poetry is about performance. It's a short 3-minute time frame. It's very snappy. It uses lots of couplets, internal rhyme, and it makes a lot of kind of references to kind of global ideas.
Yeah.
And it's about the audience. It's about audience engagement as much as it is about the content of the words. And it's a shared experience with a group of people. So it's about community as opposed to reading something by yourself on a piece of paper.
If someone wants to become a folklorist, what are some steps to take?
I think if people are interested to become a folklorist, I mean, everybody's a folklorist in different ways. So if you think about, you have to kind of ask yourself, what are you interested in? What do you want to know about the society that you live in, the place that you live in? And start asking questions. If you live in a certain neighborhood, you're interested in the history of that place, or you want to find out what actually took place in these places, then go ask people, because the history of places tend to be with the people that are carrying those stories that might still be living there. So look around you, look at the shops, look at the newspapers, look at talk to people that are working or living in that neighborhood, and go ask questions. Go ask questions about what they know. Sometimes I think asking people that you don't know, or asking older people about their stories and listening to those stories, and then you'll think of more questions that you can ask. Mm-hmm. But finding a particular interest, and that can be absolutely anything. You know, people study the way bandanas are worn. People mm-hmm. look at rollerblading. People look at skateboarding. You know, I think there's an interest for absolutely everybody. People look at the way bumper stickers that you put on the back of cars. Mm-hmm. Going to an American football game and trying to look at it from a different perspective and just writing down the experiences. And one of the ways I like to do things is that I write a personal journal a lot. And my journal becomes great material for writing stories. So when I first came to America, and you wouldn't think that you'd be culture shocked when you come to America because I'm coming from another English-speaking country, but I was. Things was very different. When I saw, you know, the way people would walk down the street, or might be on a sort of a new type of skateboard that I've never seen before, or I get invited to a football game, or to a basketball, or a tailgate. I never knew what tailgating was. So I started writing about it. And I started writing about how I felt about it, how, you know, these new experiences, and then I share those experiences with people that I've met. This starts to become something that I can write about.
Kiran, what resources would you suggest to prospective folklorists?
So for people interested in folklore, there's another idea. There's both the organization City Law in New York City, Philadelphia Folklore Project in Philadelphia, and Smithsonian Folklife Community based in Washington, D.C. They all have resources, and very sort of accessible resources about how to, if you're interested in place, if you're interested in community, if you're interested in dance, and they give you sort of not just this toolkit that I produced, but there's other toolkits out there.
Tell us more about your new toolkit, Telling Stories That Matter.
The resource is there for free. It can be used in any way people want to use it. There's my contact details in there, and I think it'll be really good if people wanted to respond, talk about food, talk about community, talk about divisions, serious or more fun. I think any way that we can talk and share our life experiences with each other, I think that's the way forward. Life is about communication and connecting with each other, and if we can do that online, then we can talk to each other from other parts of the world. I think that's the whole point.
Kiran, thanks so much for sharing your insights on the art of the folklorist, both here and in your new toolkit.